Okay, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I'm so happy to see you again. So last time we talked about problems of the market, using the market to control the environment. When the market breaks down, that's when we want to use law. And we want to use law specifically to respond to the problems with the market. So we made a quick list. Let's review very quickly the list we made, why the market has trouble regulating the environment. We had 7 things. Do you remember some of them?
Yes.
Lack of information by consumers.
Okay, what was one? Lack of information? Yeah. Okay, so lack of information is a problem because then consumers or actors in the market, even if they cared about the environment, if they don't have information about what's causing harm, they cannot use that. They cannot use their preference to protect the environment in a market. So you need information. This is also more generally the problem of preferences. Meeting preferences. A preference is something we desire. I desire this forest to be protected. I desire the river to stay clean. These are preferences. The market sometimes has a hard time meeting preferences. That means making things that we desire. One reason is because of the lack of information. If you don't have information that some product is harming the environment, then the market will not meet your preference to protect it because you don't have the information. Do you remember some other reasons why it's hard to meet preferences? Preference is a desire. I want to protect this forest. Why does the market make it hard for me to protect the forest? Even though this is my preference, I'm willing to pay to protect this forest. And why is it hard to meet preferences?
It can be harmful to common people.
It can be harmful to what?
To everyone. Everyone who live in the area.
It's harmful to everyone, but what makes it difficult for them to make their preference, to meet the preference, to make their desire come true?
It's difficult to know the people's desire. Sometimes people are overwhelming and some are underwhelming.
That's true. One problem is people don't understand their values. They have, they have mixed preferences or irrational preferences. Sometimes they overvalue things, sometimes they undervalue. So, and this doesn't work. And another reason, well, let me just go down the list. If I go off the list, I'll get lost. Another one was unfairness. What was the issue with unfairness? Markets are not good at being fair. They're very good at efficiency, keeping things cheap, but they're not very good at fairness. Yeah, what's an example of something very unfair? Very cheap, but very unfair. Yeah, for example, some land is very cheap for disposal. We can throw away our toxic waste or have a landfill. But usually very poor people live near there. It's unfair to these poor, vulnerable people that we put all the waste in their neighborhood, and rich people do not have to have this risk. So that's unfair. Even though it's very cheap, it's unfair to the poor, vulnerable people. They can't protect themselves. Another problem with the market is that environment does not equal money. That's not a perfect exchange. Markets are about exchange. I give you money and you give me something I desire. The one problem is it's very difficult to put a price tag, money, for a clean river or for a forest. How do you value that? The exchange, it's not easy to translate environmental protection into money. So even if I'm willing to pay to protect a river, or maybe a company is willing to pay me to pollute. They say, I will give you money if you will allow me to pollute this river or to cut these trees. You may get money, but it's not a perfect translation, because if we lose this clean water, you know, we talked before about irreversible harms. This is a harm that money cannot compensate, because now the river is permanently polluted. So markets have a problem translating everything into money. Markets want to translate everything into money. That's a problem for environmental protection. Another one was this. Do you remember this word? Externalities. What was an externality? This is the cost and benefits. Outside the, I guess you could call the budget. Yeah, outside the transaction. Outside the budget or transaction. So, a company wants to make a profit, but a profit is benefits minus costs. So if a company has to pay a cost, it will try very hard to push the cost as low as possible. The problem with environmental harm is it's external to the transaction. A company, they will have to pay to dispose of their waste. If they have to pay a truck to pick up their waste and carry it away, that's a cost. If they just toss it into the forest, that's an externality. They do that for free. But that doesn't mean there's no cost. There is a cost, but the forest is paying the cost, not the company. So, who pays the cost? You want to internalize the cost. But if the cost is outside what the company pays, it's a problem for the market to deal with. Number 6. The environment. Do you remember public and private goods?
Public good.
Is a public good. What does a public good mean? Who remembers? What's a public good? What's an example of a public good?
Park.
Things like a park, and also a river, a forest, things that no individual owns, but we all can collectively own.
This means you cannot exclude another person.
That's right. The definition of a public good is cannot exclude. So what's the problem with protecting? Why is it very hard to protect a public good?
No one.
Yeah, when you don't have one owner, then there's no incentive for you to protect it as an individual. Because you expect other people will protect it. And everybody thinks the same way, so then the market undersupplies. The market will not have many people that will meet their preferences, and these people are called free riders. Free riders. So many people will just expect someone else will take care of it. I do not need to pay to protect this park. Someone else will take care of it. So not much money ever goes to protect parks and rivers and forests because of this problem, because it's a public good. All public goods have this problem. And then the last one was transaction costs. Every transaction, every time you make a deal with someone, there are some costs. So for many environmental issues, you're talking about like a river with many thousands of people that live along the river. If the company wanted to pollute the river and it has many thousands of people to have an agreement, it would be huge transaction costs to get them to agree how to protect it. It's much better if the government had experts and they decided what's the best thing for society. Instead of getting everybody together to have a transaction, that's too expensive. Maybe it's better, too expensive for market. It's too expensive for the market to have everybody have a deal on how to pollute this river. It's better if the government just regulates it, much cheaper. So these are the 7 things. So the last thing we ended on class last time is what can regulation do? What can the government do in law to try to help some of these problems? And we talked about, for example, the lack of information. What can the government do to stop this being as much of a problem? What were some things we can do? If lack of information is a problem for environmental protection, what can the government do to help this? To let the market help a little to protect the environment? Yeah, so regulations for transparency. Like environmental impact assessments or labels. This will give consumers information and then they can meet their preferences. How about externalities? What's a way that we can stop externalities? Remember, externalities were costs the company does not have to pay. What can the government do to make sure companies pay that cost?
Regulation.
How does regulation make them pay?
Regulation on their budget.
What's that?
Make the external cost to their budget.
Yeah, so one way is if they break a law, they can pay a fine. Pay a fine.
Fine.
So you can have a regulation to obey this rule, and if they break it, they can pay a fine. That will internalize the cost. And another one was if someone's injured by some chemical, you can have a lawsuit. And a lawsuit will, if they really caused this harm, then the company will have to pay the costs. And then what about environment as a public good? When we talked about things like, do you remember the fish example? Fish is a public good. So even though all the fishermen do not want to catch too many fish, because then that will kill all the fish and they will all lose money. But they all want to cheat. So what's one way to, is there a way to change a public good to something like a private good? Because private goods, you know, like when I buy something that I own myself, like a private good, then I will pay to make sure that's protected. Can you think of how to make a public good more like a private good? This may be a hard question. I don't know if you have heard this kind of answer, but what do you think? What's one way we can help the fishermen to stop catching too many fish? Or loggers cutting down too many trees? Or in the park? Well, regulation, but people have an incentive to cheat. One solution may be something like property rights. You can give people property rights for a public good. Something like property rights, not exactly, but an example with for example, with the climate, well, the fish may be better. You give a property right for the number of fish that a fisherman can catch. Like if you say you can catch 500 pounds of fish, 500 pounds, then you can say, you the fisherman, you own 500 pounds of these fish. That's like your property. And then if you have one fisherman that catches more than that, it's not that they're just cheating, they're taking someone else's property. Do you understand? If they start taking more than 500 pounds of fish, they're taking another fisherman's property, and then they can sue to enforce their property right. It's a way to protect a public good if you have something like a property right that the government can create by regulation. I think this happens very often with logging. It's easy with logging because it's on a land. You actually let loggers buy the land or have a concession, and then they own the land where they can cut the trees. That's one way to keep them from not cutting too many trees, because if they go into someone else's land, they have a property right in that land, and they can protect their own property rights. But there are problems with property rights too. As you know, I mean, in Burma and Cambodia also, we learned about the problems with land concessions and land use. Sometimes the government is abusive with property rights. And people, you know, also some unfairness too. Certain people can get property rights, but other people cannot get property rights. So we can talk about land use and property rights. But sometimes property rights can be a way to protect something like a public good. Okay, so that's that. So did anyone have any questions about any of these that they didn't understand? I think if you had to understand the two things, it would be these two things. Maybe really important, the externalities problem and the public good problem. If you understand why companies don't like to protect because they don't pay the cost. And when they do protect, they don't get the benefit. So that externalities is a big problem. And then the public good problem. Individuals do not have an incentive when they think other people will take care. So these are the two most important things, I think, to understand. All right, so let's talk about the alternative to the market, which is government regulation. So has everyone written this down?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's turn to government regulation now.
Sure.
Yes.
I want to know about transaction costs.
About transactional costs?
Yes. You said sometimes administrative cost is cheap and sometimes it's expensive. Why it's different?
Okay, so let's talk about that's market versus government. In the market, you have transaction costs, which means people buy the right to pollute. Some company says, I mean, it's hard to imagine the example, but a company wants to put some chemical into the river, and they go to every house and say, we're going to put this chemical in, I'm giving you money if you give me the right. But that's very expensive to do. So that's why we don't see market transactions for this kind of case, because the transaction costs are too expensive. It's the company going to every house and giving them money to pollute. And then government regulation, it means, what do you have to spend money for in government regulation? What kinds of things? If you want to have a government regulation. Tax? Well, that's the money coming in, and then the money goes out. What does the money go out into? Who's getting paid? What's that?
Nothing.
Nobody? If nobody gets paid, then government doesn't work. I mean, somebody has to, the money has to go, your tax money goes somewhere. So it probably, for the, I I mean, I know before rivers, forests are easier because you have the Ministry of Forestry. Ministry of Forestry. And then under the Ministry of Forestry, there's like five sub-ministries. I can't remember all their names. And they have a staff. So you're paying their staff. They'll need experts that understand how forests work, that understand the science and economics. And if they have this kind of problem where loggers are cutting too much wood, they'll need to send people to investigate, and to enforce the law. So there's so many expenses you need to pay for government regulation too. But it's a different kind of expense. This is hiring staff. You're paying for staff. Yeah, staff and expertise. Maybe they need equipment, whatever they need to, It depends on what the government regulation is.
So the government have to pay money to the government directly.
Well, the government gets the money from taxes. But if you had a regulation where the government pays some fine, then maybe that fine would go to the ministry. We have to research. It's administrative costs is also the company maybe sometimes has to fill out some forms. The company has to do work too to comply with the government. And so that makes the company more expensive. They have to spend money, which has nothing to do with the market. It's only for what the government wants. So that's an administrative cost too. Yes?
Environment is public good.
Public good?
So you have to protect environment. Right?
Yeah. This is why the government is better to protect the environment than individuals. Private individuals cannot protect the environment by themselves. Even if everybody in your country loved the environment and wanted to protect it, it's very, very difficult. This is why we need government regulation.
So property rights. So you mean property rights is public property rights.
Well, there are different kinds of property rights. You could give property rights to a community. It's hard to talk about this generally. We need to look at the specific case. So later in the course, we will look at all the major environmental issues for Burma. So one of the major one is logging, which is cutting trees. So we will talk about property rights to logging companies, but there are different kinds. I understand in Burma they have property rights for communities, community logging, where an entire village collectively owns a forest, and they have certain rights to cut that forest. So we'll talk about different kinds of property rights to protect the forest, to make sure they can make money, a living, and also to protect the forest from being overcut. But yeah, if you gave property rights to a community that owns this piece of forest, then if other people cut down the forest, then this community can enforce their property rights. The point of a public good is you cannot enforce your right. That was the definition. Remember, you just cannot exclude others. Cannot enforce right. So even if someone were very passionate to protect this forest, if it's a public good, they cannot enforce their right to protect it. A right. They cannot exclude others from cutting it. But if somebody has a property right in the land, then if someone else tries to cut their forest, they can bring a lawsuit to exclude them, to stop them from cutting down their trees. So that's how property rights can work. But there are problems with property rights too that we will look at. But we will have to look at the specific case. It's difficult to look at it generally.
Teacher,
Yes.
the next one we may have
a village, the leader community, and go to the government and then make a register for the river that is near their village. And then no one can fish and no one can.
Rivers are very. We'll have to look at the law, but under common law, rivers can never be owned. You cannot own a river. Under common law, rivers are a public good. Rivers are owned by, they're either owned by the state, but you cannot get individual property rights in a river or a lake. The problem with rivers is because you cannot close one little part because you need boats that can go to navigate the entire river. And if you understand, if you had people that owned different parts, you could never have boats because they would charge a tax, some fee to go through every little part. Every mile you have to pay a new fee. And so you could never have boats. So under the common law, you cannot have property rights on rivers. But maybe you might on the fish. That's what some countries have tried to have rights for the fish in the river or in the ocean. Even though you can't own the water, maybe you can own the fish, but that's a question.
We have that in our community.
Oh, really? From your home community?
Yeah. That is a part, includes in a part of our culture. Like, you cannot fish in the
Okay. Yeah, you can put certain restrictions on. Yeah, I mean, the common law restriction was navigation. You cannot stop boats traveling through your river. But you can have certain restrictions. That's right. You can say no fishing in this zone. No certain kinds of exploitation. That's right. Or putting chemicals into the river. There are many regulations you can have. Yeah.
Things cannot throw away from the river.
You cannot throw things away into the river. Dispose. I mean, like waste.
I think people can catch the fish, right?
Well, we have to look at the laws, specific laws.
Not they cannot use the chemical to catch the.
Oh, they cannot use like a crane or a certain kind of net?
Like with chemical.
Chemicals. Yeah, I mean, that could be a regulation. Well, we have to look at the law. We're going to look at the specific ones, so, I mean, maybe we can look at rivers. I'll have a list of the topics we will look at, and then we will look at each one specifically. So, for this, I just wanted you to know the general principle, just the general principle. Public goods are difficult to regulate. Property rights are one way to try to get around that. If you let people own certain things of the river, have certain control, then if they can enforce it, a property right means you can enforce it. You can go to the court or to the government and say, stop them from doing this. And of course the government, but remember this is in the market. But for government regulation, the government always, if the river is government land, then the government can put whatever regulation. Well, let's talk about that. That was our next topic. What's the advantage of government regulation? Government regulation. So with markets, we had to look at people's preferences. But for government regulation, one thing is it does not have to care about preferences. The government can just regulate. So, no concern for preference. And you do not have to have a specific transaction. The government can just regulate. It can just, it can just put a specific limitation directly by regulation. So you do not have to concern with with judging preferences. and you do not have to actually have a transaction. The government can just regulate directly. This is an advantage of government regulation. Government can regulate directly.
Government regulation. Teacher, would you like to use the blue pen? Cannot see.
Is the blue pen better? Government. Government. Alright, so there's no concern for preference or cost benefit. I shouldn't say there's no concern, not limited. I should say not limited by. So a private company, they have to worry about profit. So they want to get the most money with the least costs. And they have to worry about what the consumer will buy. But the government does not have these worries. The government is not limited. So that's why the government, even if there are externalities, the government does not get more tax money when it protects the environment. But the government is not limited by that. It does not need to make money off of regulation. So it's not limited by preference or cost benefit. This is an advantage of government regulation over the market. So it's not technically limited, but preference still matters because politicians still need to be accountable to the people they represent. So they want to be re-elected. So politicians still have to think about what people think. And the government does think about costs and benefits. Especially, if companies complain. But, if companies are burdened too much, there's too much regulation, then it will be difficult for them to hire people. There will be unemployment and people will complain. So the government cannot just regulate everything and destroy companies either. So they need to think about costs and benefits and preferences, but they're not limited. This is an advantage because a market is limited by preference and cost benefit. The government is not limited by preference or cost benefit. The government can just regulate directly. So this is advantage. Advantages of government regulation. This is the advantage of government regulation. It's not limited by preference or cost benefit. They can just regulate directly. And then, I think in the last class we talked about problems with government regulation.
Yeah.
What were some problems?
Uncertainty.
Yeah, well, governments have problems with uncertainty. Well, they can still regulate. They just have a problem picking the right regulations. Governments worry about regulations' effects. The governments worry about regulations' effects. The reason why uncertainty is a problem because uncertainty means you have to balance, you have to make a choice. Between environmental protection and the economy. Anytime there's uncertainty, you will know sometimes you will get the answer wrong. Sometimes you will uncertainty means sometimes you will regulate when there's not risk, and sometimes you will not regulate when there is risk. If you regulate when there is not risk, then you hurt the economy without protecting the environment. If you do not regulate when there is risk, then maybe you've helped the economy, but you hurt the environment. Uncertainty means we don't know who are helping, so we have to pick environmental protection or economy. Which do we protect when we don't have information? We don't know, so we have to make a choice between protecting the environment or protecting the economy, and we don't know which one is the risk real or not. So, are we hurting the economy to help the environment, or are we hurting the economy with no help at all? So sometimes we have to make a choice. So governments worry about regulations' effects, and uncertainty makes it difficult to know what the effects are. So that makes governments worry. So that's one problem. Make a choice between environmental protection and economy when you don't know which is right. This is like, there's like a closed door here, and behind it is A or B. So we don't know until 10 years later. Then they open the door and we see if it's A or B. But right now we have a closed door. A or B is behind it. So we have to make a choice. Is it better to bet on A or is it better to bet on B? What's the better bet? Is it better to bet on environmental protection, or is it better to bet we want economic growth? If it's a closed door, so we don't know what's behind it. So you say, when you don't have information, which should we bet on? Should we bet on protecting the environment more? Because what will happen is sometimes you will protect the environment when it will not need it. You're spending more money than you need to on the environment because you think A is more important than B.
Teacher,
Yes?
like some product, in the product we see that made in China, made in Japan, or something like that. So this is a kind of transparency.
Yeah, for environmental protection, yes, because China has very low environmental standards, and Japan has very high environmental standards. So if you see that label, if you know that China has very low standards, then this label, you will know that some of your money is leading to environmental problems. But there's another problem between that, because what are you buying? What's the label for? Is it a shirt?
Like computer and like especially machine.
A machine?
Yeah.
Does China make computers?
Like
Toshiba? Oh no, that's Japanese. Okay. The difference probably is the Chinese computer is like $150 and the Japan computer is $700. So you can see the label and know that you're hurting the environment with China, but when it's $700 and $100, how much do you really care when it's hundreds of dollars different?
this project are also made in China.
This projector?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, so we have to think about what are their labor standards and environmental standards. Maybe they were low. I don't know, they're probably better for this kind of company. I'm thinking more like people that make shirts or, basic goods, probably even have, or chemical companies. It depends on, different industries work differently. Okay, and then so that was one problem with government regulation. A second problem we talked about before. This is the term we use. Political capture. Yeah. Corruption also. Political capture is when some company spends money, a lot of money, to protect their interests. So then the company will politically capture the politician. Politicians follow the company. Follow rich companies. And not poor people. Political capture or corruption. Politicians will follow rich companies and not poor people. This is very similar to the public good, because poor people do not fight for their rights very often. For the same reason we were talking about before. Poor people will think, oh, there's so many of us, someone else will care about this problem. I don't have to care about this problem because someone else will care about it. So poor people generally will not fight for their rights. But rich companies will always fight for their rights. Rich companies will fight very hard, and they have a lot of money to fight. So they will be able to spend a lot of money to capture politicians. And if it's very bad, it will even lead to corruption. So this is another issue with government regulation that you always have to think about. I mean, that's one reason why sometimes the market, you know, the market is very harsh, but the market is usually, you know, the market doesn't care about corrupting. It just cares about what people want and changing money. So sometimes you can avoid corruption in the market. If you can give a company a reason to clean up the environment, they will clean it up just to save money, without even worrying about the regulation. Okay, one thing. So this is market versus government. One thing I wanted to mention that's also in many debates is the issue of values. So like at the beginning I said, environmental law is very sensitive to science and economics, and people sometimes try to say these are value neutral, which means, you know, the science is the same for everybody. Everybody can agree on the science. Everybody can agree on the economics. So all we need to do is hire a few scientists, and they will give us an answer, and we just put into law whatever they say, and we all agree. But in reality, this does not happen because environmental law is very driven by values. So, for example, one value is the benefit for future generations. For example, this is a value. This is not something a scientist can answer for you. A scientist can tell you, if you do this, if you put this chemical in, there may be effects 10 or 20 or 30 years later that we should think about. But people will disagree. To what extent should we care about future generations versus our development right now? Especially if we think about it, Burma right now is in a transition period. So as the government is transitioning, you're going to have foreign investment coming in, and Burma should have a spurt of development. More money will come in, you'll have development. So then people will debate, what is more important? What do we owe future generations? What do we owe them? What do we owe? What do we owe to future generations? Do we owe them development or a clean environment? Of course, we owe them both. We owe our children and grandchildren development and clean environment. But the question is the balance. You will have a lot of development in Burma over the next 10 years. You need to think about, in the future, what do you owe your children and grandchildren while you're developing right now? Do you owe them development? If we have more power stations now, I read about the dam projects in Burma. There's 48. 48. That's so many. For every dam project, you're having to move some villages, and you're displacing people's lives, and you're changing the river system. But you're also creating a lot of electricity that people can use. So you think about these future generations. If we have more electricity now, you have more people learning how to read. You know, there's a direct correlation between electricity and literacy. When people do not have electricity, they cannot even learn something as basic to read. And this is one of the most basic elements to your economy. When you have literate people, then you can build your economy higher. But you also have to displace these villages and destroy river systems. So this is a value to think about. What do you owe your future generations? Do you want your economy to be much stronger for them so that they can have better jobs? Or do you want them to have rivers that they can go to and a clean environment and health and safety? So this is a value. This is not something that a scientist or an economist can answer. This is something that people think about as a value in itself. The reason why this is important is because there's uncertainty about the future. Again, it comes back to uncertainty about the future. People that value development will say, when we create these dam projects, the environment will be okay. They will use uncertainty and say, because we don't know what exactly will happen to the environment, it should be okay. We will create new technology. We will invent some invention that will make the rivers flow well again. And then people that value the clean environment or social protection, you know, maybe they will be more pessimistic. They say, we do not know what will happen in the future, but I know if you move these villages, you will destroy these people's lives, and their children and grandchildren's lives will still be affected. So there's uncertainty. So when you have these two different sides, people will have a different story about what will happen in the future. They're not really, the point is, they're not really arguing the science or economics. Many arguments in environment are not arguments about science or economics, but about values. So, when we look next, after we go through the introduction, we will start to look at case studies. We will look at like deforestation and maybe fishing, climate change, many different environmental issues that Burma has. You will see people arguing about science and economics. They'll argue, some scientists are saying this and some scientists are saying this. The lesson I want to teach you right now is they're not really arguing about the science and economics always. What they're really arguing about is they disagree on values. And they're choosing the scientists that promote their values, or they're choosing the economists that support their values. So many arguments are not really about science and economics. The real arguments are about values. And a company, for example, a company and a village on two sides of a case, they disagree mostly about values. And they're choosing science and economic arguments to support their values. And this is an example of a disagreement in values. What do we owe future generations? Do we owe them more development, or do we owe them a clean environment and social protection? This is what they're really disagreeing about. When a company and a village have a legal dispute, this is what they're really disagreeing about as a matter of values. But of course, in government regulation in a court of law, you cannot make this argument to the regulation. Often you have to argue about do you know what I mean? In the actual trial, you'll have to argue using science and economics in your arguments. But the lesson I'm teaching you now, this is not what they really disagree about. They don't really disagree about the science, they really disagree about the values. So when we're looking at environmental cases, sometimes let's think about, you know, they have two different theories of science, but let's think about what do they really disagree about? What's the value that they really disagree about when we look at cases? And of course, the difference in values will make a difference in your goals. If you care more about development, you'll care more about building dam projects, because this is what all you see. You're looking at Burma, you're looking at the country in economic terms. How much, you know, what's its GDP? How much money is it producing? How much of it is getting electricity? What's the, you know, what's the average salary of people? What's the employment? And people that are thinking about the environment and social protection are thinking about the livelihoods of people living on the ground. I had one example on an issue that I worked on. I worked on climate change, and then there's often the disagreement about values will latch onto a word. Some definition in a law, you will see a word and it will not have an exact definition, so that will become like a hook. They will argue about this definition and they'll put the values into the argument. So what I remember was in climate change, Article 2 of the Framework Convention, I think it's UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, Framework Convention on Climate Change. Article 2 says, paraphrasing, it says, avoid human-made dangerous change of climate. This is what article, so this is the purpose of Article 2. All the other articles in the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol, they all come back to the main objective, which is to avoid human-made dangerous change of climate. This is not the exact text. You can look it up, but it's something like this. So the convention does not define the word dangerous. It leaves the word open. So what you have is you have people creating an argument over what is dangerous. What is dangerous? And they have big disagreements over what dangerous means. Whenever you have this kind of term that's undefined, then the debate on values, this is what will happen. The people that have two different values will find this word and they'll try to use their definition that will support their values. What's very difficult though, something like this is dangerous may mean different things to different people. So I remember reading some of the reports about the definition of dangerous. Denmark, when Denmark was giving its definition, in Denmark, you know, it's in the north part of Europe. It gets cold in the winter. They have a really famous ice skating festival. They really love their ice skating festival. And they're afraid if the climate gets too hot, you know, they will not be able to have their beautiful ice skating festival. every year because the ice will not freeze. The water will not freeze that year. So for them, this is like a loss of their culture. And they wanted to put that into the meaning of dangerous. This is like a lot, tragedy, loss of our culture we can never get back because we can't have our wonderful festival. That was Denmark. Do you remember the Maldives, the island country, just off of in the Indian Sea? Yeah, what's their definition of dangerous, do you think? Yeah, their entire country will be underwater. I mean, if you compare those, like Denmark loses its ice skating festival, that's awful. But the Maldives maybe go completely underwater, the entire country. You know, it's just completely different scale of thinking. And, you know, this is we will talk about international law, international environmental law later. But, you know, in international law, there's sovereign equality between countries. So it's very difficult to say one country's idea of dangerous is better or worse than another country's because they're sovereign countries. They have their own understandings when they pass the treaty. But this is, you know, it comes back down to values. Difference in values is what's actually driving the arguments. I had some more examples, but that's okay. By the way, this idea you can find in law everywhere. Almost every field of law, there will be some term that's undefined, and they'll start arguing what's the meaning of this term. You can see it in criminal law, you can see it in torts, you can see it in contract law. People are arguing about their values in terms through this definition argument. That's what we do in cases all the time. Okay, so that brings us through the introduction. Let's talk about environmental issues in Burma. Did everyone write this down?
Yes.
Not? Environmental issues in Burma. So these are the issues that we will look at in this class. So first of all, you tell me, what do you think? I have done research to make a list of what I found were the environmental issues, but what do you think are the major environmental issues in Burma? Yes, deforestation is a big one. Of course, mining, deforestation. What else? What's that?
Landslide.
Landslides? What causes landslides?
Not so much.
The water. Okay, well I know it causes them, but that will become part of climate change. We will talk about landslides and part of climate change because climate change means more rain. More rain means more landslides.
Water pollution. Water pollution.
Water pollution? Which kind of water pollution? Are you talking about? No, I mean in cities or in rural areas. Well, they're a little different. Okay. Cities and rural.
Village pollution.
Village pollution. Waste disposal. Yes. Especially in the cities. What else? Anything else? What are Burma's main industries, main economic areas? Agriculture. Agriculture is an environmental issue. Well, that will be part. We'll talk about agriculture and concessions, because you can't talk about agriculture without talking about the concessions. Agriculture is a major environmental issue. You have to talk about the crops, and you have to talk about the effects that agriculture has on the environment around it. And the agriculture itself is part of the environment. So agriculture is a major one.
And then or hydropower.
Yes. Dams. Hydropower. Any others?
Pipeline.
Pipelines? Oil. Oil in the pipelines and extraction. Yes. Oil and gas.
What about the wet? The wet deep sea pot.
Deep sea what?
Deep sea pot. The wet.
Seaport? What about the seaports?
Like in the fishing, in the west, they are going to make a sea pot there, a ship.
And it's, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's a bad thing for the environment.
Bad thing for the environment? Okay. Well, we can
So industries.
development and industry. We can put that under general development and industry, because they're trying to build the economy, and they need infrastructure. Anything else? I'll write another one. Yeah, Burma has a very special environment for certain kinds of wildlife. So there are certain areas where many species exist only in Burma. So, and part of that is trade in species. Some people are trading wildlife like goods, and there's a problem with that too.
What about civil war?
Civil war and environment? That's an issue. That's a definite issue.
It also costs environment.
Yes, that's true. War and environment. After there's been a lot of warfare, you need to reconstruct. You need to have reconstruction and reparations after warfare. So there's so many problems. You have so many people's lives that you have to rebuild after conflict. So many times people are not thinking about the environment, but also the environment will be hurt by warfare. I don't know if we'll talk about this one, but that's a definite issue. And then we should also talk about the big one. This affects everybody, but it will also affect...
Come on. Good.
Huh?
Climate change. It affects everybody.
Yeah, it affects everybody, including Burma. So one way climate change will be especially bad is because storms will be more severe. Sea level, the level of the water will rise, and the storms, the hurricane, cyclones will be more powerful. So you had the two terrible cyclones. What was the names again? Narjik. And then you had one in 2010 too. Yeah. So these are occurring more and more often, and they will only get worse with climate change. So it's a very serious issue. The other problem, many more people are living along the coast. If they build a seaport, they're developing coastal areas. More and more people will live on the coast. It'll bring more and more problems with these huge disasters. Yeah, so it's terrible for the weather disasters, the cyclones. It's also going to be bad for agriculture. They'll have many terrible effects. So those are environmental issues. And then what about the needs of Burma with relation to so environmental law is different for different kinds of countries. I studied the kind of environmental law I originally practiced was American environmental law, but it will have much different needs. Environmental law has different needs for America than it will for a developing country. Developing countries generally, developing countries. Needs of developing countries like Burma with regards to environmental law.
What is Burma WIRT?
That's with regards to needs of Burma. I'll just put with. Easy. Needs of Burma with environmental law. Or with regards to environmental law. Can you think of, so for example, in American environmental law, they're very worried about the emission of carbon because they have these huge power stations and many cars. So, you know, they're worried about this emission of carbon, but that's different than something like developing countries would be worried about. I may need to give a list. I'll start a list and then you can add things if you think about them. But one thing that's a definite need for developing countries is institutional capacity. So institutional capacity means you need financing, this is I'm talking about the agencies. Like the Ministry of Forestry, the government agencies.
Ministry of Environment.
Yeah, all the government ministries that deal with environmental law. Forestry may be the biggest one, but there are others. There's one for agriculture. They need financing, they need expertise. They need expertise, both science expertise and legal. And yeah, they need legal reform. Technology transfer. Okay, so institutional capacity, financing, expertise, legal reform, technology transfer. And then we can have investment. One way to try to deal with the institutional capacity is investments. From foreign investment, and loans like the World Bank, or something we'll call the GEF, which is the General Environmental Fund. Yes?
Who put money on World Bank?
Donor countries. Rich, yes. Rich countries give money in, and then for development. But there are problems with, of course, there are many problems with foreign investment that we will talk. So right now, as I read, Burma's in areas with the World Bank, which means you cannot get any new loans from the World Bank until you pay off the debts from the past.
I think their World Bank is going to give money for like this seaport project.
Okay.
And then
They're giving-
Japan and China is going to invest in this project.
Yeah, there are many. So, foreign investment is a mixed blessing because many of the projects that are being invested in are bad for the environment and for people, like the dam projects and maybe the seaport project. So, we want to make sure this money coming in has protections, so that if they use this money, they need to commit to certain protections, so that they do not destroy the environment. The JEF is an important one. This is one of the major important funders for environmental capacity. General Environmental Fund. JEF stands for General Environmental Fund. This gives money to countries to implement environmental treaties. Money to countries to implement environmental treaties. And build capacity. So they're giving money to the environmental agencies to help them be better environmental agencies. The World Bank isn't a very good example. The World Bank has a bad reputation for giving loans for projects that are bad for the environment and very little social protection for people affected. The General Environmental Fund is a very good fund for building capacity in the agencies and implementing environmental treaties. But developing countries like Burma, they need help for institutional capacity. But you know, you cannot you don't want imperialism. You don't want some other country just telling how to run the government. So there always needs to be a balance. Burma needs to see a benefit. If money is coming into the country needs to see a benefit. You want the agencies' capacity to be better agencies. You do not want some development project coming in and all the expertise stay, like China developed some project and all the experts doing it are Chinese. Burma does not learn anything like this. It's good when money comes in and they appoint, they're going to Burmese agencies so you can have experts in your country that can learn how to do development projects responsibly and have environmental protection. But we'll talk about investments and capacity. And then the needs, of course, the need for development. Another project, what's our time? Okay, so I can tell the one story for this one. One of the projects I worked on was a World Bank finance project in South Africa. They were building a huge power plant, massive coal-burning plant, and they were going to emit a lot of sulfur dioxide. This is sulfur dioxide. It's really terrible for the air quality. In cities especially, it makes it hard to breathe. So, and then also mercury was inside. Anytime you burn coal, you'll have mercury put into the air. So it's really terrible stuff. But South Africa was saying we have entire regions that do not have electricity and the illiteracy rate is very low. So our needs for development we really need this electricity because in our development we've hit a roof and we cannot get over this roof unless we have more electricity. It's a very powerful argument. When a country tells you we have entire areas of our land where the literacy rate, people cannot learn how to read and they cannot get a good job until they have electricity. It's a very powerful argument, the needs for development. So with environmental protection, we still should always think, we shouldn't ignore the needs for development in thinking about the environment protection also. We want to balance both. We want to say, yes, you can have electricity, just try not to have so much sulfur dioxide and mercury, please. Okay, we'll continue this after the break.